Hey, what's up, people? Welcome to live stream. We're just doing a sort of a semi-improv thing. It was 114 years ago today. Well, 114 years ago today, if we're a little bit into the day after now, just through scheduling reasons. But Dixie Kid and Sam Langford had their first battle, and this one happened at the Armory in Boston. And I've got Josh City from 86 Boxing here. We're just going to talk about it a little bit. What's up, Josh?
Hey, what's going on, Random? Appreciate being here as always. Always good to have discussion on the great history on late night, but it's worthwhile.
Yeah, man. It's like, and this fight happened. Well, firstly, it's great having you here. Secondly, yeah, this fight happened sort of in the wake of Jack Johnson and Sam Langford's hotly anticipated May 1909 fight not happening. Sort of the fallout of that, where Johnson had become undisputed. He beat Tommy Burns at the end of 1908 to unify the color championship, and then what had until then been the white championship. Boom, got an undisputed champion. He's booked to fight Langford in May in London. Backs out of the fight, doesn't happen. In the aftermath of that, people are making claims, as you know, like making claims about the okay, so Johnson's not going to defend his colored heavyweight claim or fight the top, colored fighters, heavyweights. So they're fighting each other for this claim. This was part of that lineage. Do you want to get into that just a tiny bit, Josh? I know it gets very complicated, like the difference between like titles and claims, because there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Yeah, certainly. We can dive into that. So, realistically, when you look at it, title claims, or let's just say the titles in themselves, essentially derive from what could be considered claims. Now, I was recently doing a live on CC Smith, who was the first colored world heavyweight champion, and it was essentially established via claim. Now, if you look back through history, even beyond such, and we think about what is known as the world heavyweight title, you could argue it was established via claim in some sense as well. When you factor in that there were varying points in which there were different boxers who laid claim to or felt that they were the actual world champions, and they may or may not have necessarily established such through fighting who might have been considered the world heavyweight champion by consensus. But that being said, there was nothing necessarily that stopped them from actually making those claims. One of the big deciding, or I guess you can say dividing factors, was primarily tied to the fact that media played a big role in what ultimately made it to the masses as it does today. Of course, without media, without other individuals involved, then you can fight, but no one knows. So if you think about the heavyweight championship of the world heavyweight championship, the one that we consider the lineal championship, it was essentially established by virtue of a claim that was ultimately solidified by the media during the time, and that was the National Police Gazette. So you think about John L. Sullivan, he went on a run and he started to actually pick up steam. At that particular time, you had a mix of a number of individuals who were actually champions of varying status, and that was not only in the United States but people abroad as well. So John L. Sullivan, he picked up a ton of steam here in the United States of America, and eventually he fought Patty Ryan, who was considered to be the quote unquote American heavyweight champion. And you could argue, hey, that ties to the world in some sense. But that being said, Patty Ryan at the time had backing by the National Police Gazette. Eventually, Sullivan defeated Patty Ryan. A lot of things in between, of course, but eventually Sullivan defeated Patty Ryan. He laid claim and essentially became the American heavyweight champion. Mind you, this was done under London prize ring rules. Now it gets a bit complicated because you had champions of England, etc. that were out there. But eventually, also, Sullivan in 1889 fought Jake Kilrain, who at the time was being recognized as the world bare knuckle champion. And the National Police Gazette established such. They had a some form of a title, more so medal, that was tied to it. And Kilrain had done so by defeating Jim Smith, who was the bare knuckle champion of the world or bare knuckle champion of England and that particular area there in the UK. So when Sullivan defeated Jake Kilrain, in a sense, this became the point in which the world heavyweight title, I guess you can say, was established. Now, as for the World Colored Heavyweight Championship, I mentioned C.C. Smith, so that lineage was established also through the actual National Police Gazette. They actually provided a medal as well that was tied to the champion. Of course, we don't have that medal right now here today, but it was substantiated through media. And I had an argument with an individual in the comments a good while back. And I was trying to mention this same thing. When you think about these claims, you think about the titles, it's established through media. National Police Gazette, that was the marquee, that was the number one paper, number one form of media at the time. As a matter of fact, they were transcended in some sense. And therefore, that's how we ended up getting that world heavyweight title reign, especially when Sullivan defeated Kilrain, and he was already a proponent for the Marquis of Queensberry rules. And that's what leads us to where we are today. And something you've pointed out before there, Random, is, of course, it can be disputed whether Sullivan was considered the undisputed world heavyweight champion, because he essentially was not, because guys like C.C. Smith, Peter Jackson, they didn't get a shot at the world heavyweight title. And therefore, those were considered to be some of the other great boxers at that particular period. And therefore, their claim, them having their lineage established through the same media source, National Police Gazette, it holds merit. And because we didn't get that fight and the National Police Gazette was calling for it, we ultimately did not get to see the best, would have been best black fighter at the time versus the best white fighter at the time. So on and so forth. The story could continue to extend on, but think about that and think about similarities with some of the other weights. And that's where we get in the likes of Sam Langford having the colored world heavyweight title, and others who may have gotten some of the other established world colored titles at some points in their career. And that's no different here, though Dixie Kid himself, he was essentially at one point world heavyweight champion, and it's under controversial fashion, which we'll talk about, but he was able to establish such or be able to become world heavyweight champion because at that particular time in that fight, he had defeated Barbados Joe Walcott, who had the legitimate world heavyweight championship.
She said heavy, you meant welter, though, of course.
Yeah, welter. Sorry, yeah, welter. But yeah, I meant welterweight, not heavyweight, certainly. But yeah, Dixie Kid had defeated him, and of course, Barbados had the legitimate world welterweight title. Now, a lot of the and lastly, I'll say before handing it back to you, Random, the issue wasn't necessarily with the smaller weights in most cases. When you think about the color line being drawn and some of these black fighters getting a shot at the title, it was more so heavyweight, because the heavyweight division, as we know, it was the marquee division, and it should be, and in a sense, it is still a marquee division today. We want to see the best fighting the best, but there's no question in the history of the sport of boxing, dating back to this time, and then if you just travel down the path, it's always been the world heavyweight division that has driven the sport to unparalleled heights. So I'll leave it with that here for that little sort of opening dialogue there, Random.
Very cool, man. Very cool. Yeah, this is good stuff. Yeah, welcome to the chat, everybody. This is kind of improv, just because it was I did a Facebook page post on Harry Schaefer's boxing archive, or Antique Prize Ring, I think is the name of it. about this fight. And so we were like, yeah, we should do a quick live before we have to crash out. This was a very rich era for heavyweights, and they were very busy. Ali's era was broader, but this was a busier era. So top guys were piling in fights in a pretty insane manner. Langford was one of those guys. But Dixie Kid was, he was legit by this point in his career. I guess he was a small middleweight. Langford was like just a middleweight, able to make middleweight. Sometimes maybe he walked in a little over, but he was easily able to make middleweight. In fact, as you know, Josh, in as late as April 1911, he made 160. He came in at 160 to fight Sam McVeigh, who was about 200 at the time. So Langford wasn't a big guy, but he hit hard, and having 15 pounds size advantage was quite a thing, because he was in this time at Langford's for his prime. He was able to smack around much larger guys. He was the harder hitter. So you put him in an opportunity to be the larger guy, and it was ugly. And he just, apparently it was like wilting body shots that terminated Dixie Kid's opportunity. But credit to Kid, he won like 11 fights that year in 1909. He only lost to Langford that year. He won his other 11. He got 2 wins over the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark. So he was legit. It's just that, Langford hit too hard. And I guess he was tying him up with one arm and then melting his body with the other, to the ribs and the kidneys. So, yeah, I see the guys in the chat saying, was he at his peak yet? I mean, he got heavier than this and was still very fast. So maybe he got more dangerous, but he was definitely, he was one of the absolute best fighters in the whole sport. And a lot of people thought he was the best fighter for his weight in the whole sport at this time. So, we can say he certainly entered his prime, even if his absolute peak maybe, I don't know, 1911. I'm not sure. It's hard. He had a long prime. What do you think, Josh? When would you think his absolute peak was? Like, if you had to pick the single most dangerous Langford, what do you think that might be?
That is a very good question there, right there, Random. It's tough. I need to look at his record, but what I will say is that, man, there was a point Langford was operating at heavyweight. I think it maybe 1911. I think we were talking about this, where Langford actually fought when he first fought Sam McVeigh, and he was given up 41 pounds, and ultimately it was a fight that he lost, but size certainly played a major factor there.
Oh, it was that first one. No, he was heavier in that second fight that year. It was the first fight. He was 160, gave up 40 pounds, and it was a draw, but the crowd were kind of in Langford's favor because he was doing the leading, but he did get marked up. McVeigh was on the retreat. As you know, he switched it up.
So what year was that?
1911. So this is a couple. This is a couple years, almost 2 years after the fight that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I would think that, this was certainly the point of him getting there. Then probably around 1911, 1912 time frame, and somewhere in the midst of that, we were just seeing what ultimately. It is tough to say because he was doing a lot of great things, but the fact that he was able to go up in weight and do the things that he did during that period or time frame here for a few years after, or several years after, I think that's one of the best just fighting machines the sport has seen in general. And he had to be in some part of his prime, or at least some tidbits of what could be considered such, because this was also a period where he would eventually go into taking on guys like Harry Wills. I mean, you just name it. He was operating at heavyweight for the most part at a full-time standpoint. And in doing so, he was knocking out guys who were much heavier than him. And I've said it all the time, Harry Wills, I do rate him as the 4th greatest heavyweight of all time. Of course, rankings are always subjective, but one of the things was, you think about a guy like that, and I rate him that highly, but there was a period in time in which he could not do anything with Sam Langford except for lose. Generally, he could just lose. And this was probably a little bit before Harry Wills got into his absolute fighting prime. But that being said, the size was still there, the strength was still there, etc. But he was a bit early, or a bit green, I guess, in some areas you could say. And he eventually got to a point where he could defeat Langford, but that was as Langford started to go on the decline. And prior to that, that's what I'm saying. Langford, he was just a whole different animal to deal with. Mind you, all of this while he was most often the smaller guy from a weight perspective. So you think about that, and he was able to carry that power with the guy, him being a person who started at 135. He was able to carry that power all the way up. Unlike we've seen in the sport, you think about modern times, you think about Manny Pacquiao, he was able to come up from a smaller weight somewhere in or around bantamweight, flyweight, maybe even. I can't remember the exact details, but he was able to carry his power up a great deal, even up getting up to 147 and 147 pound. Of course, he fought above that. Didn't get as many knockouts there at 147, but that being said, that was historical in the sense of carrying that power up. But Sam Langford, he's one of those that was able to do it in a way that we've not seen in the sport on many occasions. And there have been others who've had power and been able to do some things to a certain degree. But Langford certainly has to be the GOAT weight climber as far as bringing his power into the fold. So I would think somewhere in and around this 1909 area up until about 1915, I would say somewhere in there, 1915, 1916, was Langford just, man, he was just a different fighter at that period, a rare breed of fighter. So even if he lost, certainly there were circumstances that may not have been in his favor. In some cases, size always being one of the big ones, but yeah, you could. It's really a toss up. I mean, you can take any version of Langford between this period we're talking here, where he fought in September of 1909, up to when he started to decline a little bit there in the heavyweight ranks. And man, I mean, he on any given night he could defeat any heavyweight that had ever laced him up in the sport.
Yeah, he was pretty scary, and they acknowledged at the time, even the big guys, most of them, even these a lot of these prideful guys would acknowledge that Langford hit the hardest. You know, even if they claimed they had other advantages or could get it done, or straight up wouldn't fight him. But yeah, he had special kind of power, and it was celebrated. But you know, it's not just that the wins fights, but he also had the experience to go with it. But just to circle back to what you were talking about with claims, so like by the time Langford was a heavyweight contender, Jeffries had retired, so he had, he had so that lineal claim. But when he retired, they had to start a new claim. So as far as like the lineage of the colored heavyweight championship and the what was until Johnson the white heavyweight championship, there was a break in there. It wasn't like a direct lineage because Marvin Hart had beaten Jack Johnson on points. I think was it that same year that he fought Jack Root? I'm trying to remember. It
Who's that?
was '05. Did Marvin Hart get Jack Johnson on points in '05, or was that earlier? I think it might have been '05.
It might have been. I need to double check, but I know what fight you're talking about for sure.
Yeah,
The one that Hart
he
got the
did the
decision,
leading.
of course, but it wasn't as straightforward as it may seem just looking at the actual decision and what the verdict was.
Yeah, that was controversial because but in the reverse of the Langford McVeigh, the first battle, in this one, Hart
Yeah.
did the leading and got rewarded with the decision, whereas Langford did the leading
Yep,
over 20
1905, as
rounds
you
with McVeigh.
mentioned,
So
FFI.
it depends on the ref, a lot of these times. But this particular ref gave it to Hart. So he did have a win over the colored heavyweight champion, but he didn't beat Jeffries. And so he fought Root and then lost his next fight to Tommy Burns. Let me see if I got a Tommy Burns picture. Here we go. And then Tommy Burns fought a bunch of people and sort of established that claim as legitimate because he was going around kicking every ass he could find. And he did actually fight with Jack Johnson, but then Johnson beat him up severely, and Johnson had won the colored, started, taking over that colored heavyweight lineage and claim in '03. So in '08, when he beats Tommy Burns, now he's the man. And supposed to fight Langford in '09, in May '09. So Langford instead fought Iron Haig, the English heavyweight champion, stopped him in 4. He got knocked down early in the fight, but he stopped him in 4, laid him flat out cold. So I mean, Langford certainly, if you're a middleweight size guy and you're the top heavyweight contender or one of the top 3 heavyweight contenders at worst, yeah, you're in your prime. So like I would say personally, I think at the end of 1906, Langford lost twice in '06. Took about 5 months off. When he came back, he won 3 fights uh, from November through the end of the year, and then went unbeaten, other than a newspaper decision loss where 2 different newspapers split it, but the ref thought Flynn got it. Other than that, in 1910, he goes unbeaten until the end of 1911, which is like just a ton of fights. So he had the close loss to Flynn, newspaper decision loss to Flynn, but he had a 35 fight unbeaten streak leading up to it and a 21 fight unbeaten streak following it, as far as what we know. So I mean, that's all prime. And the Flynn fight, it was a lot of people thought he was carrying him because he wanted a higher paying, longer booking, and which kind of played out because he was a favorite in the 3rd fight that they had, which followed the close loss, and it was for 45 rounds, and put it on him. Flynn was fighting the guys in his corner after the fight. He was so out of it, he thought he was still going. So yeah, prime Langford. So I would say his early prime, late 1906, but he was already considered one of the best fighters for his size in the sport before the end of 1906. So as far as what they thought then, they thought he was choice. By 1906, he was already absolute choice, but he was fighting above his weight enough that there wasn't always no doubt that he would win. He gave up a lot of size, as you know, Josh. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of those dudes.
Certainly, it was a norm of the time, and
Right.
that's something you have to factor in when you're discussing these types of fighters. I say it on the streams that I do all the time. All wins and losses are not remade or not created equal, and you have to factor these types of things in. As you mentioned, look at that picture there with Langford and Johnson. Of course, Langford was a smaller guy at that time, fighting at middleweight. Johnson had a little bit more size on him, and was, believe, more experience as well, having kicked things off in 1894, at least the first recorded fight I know of. Now, there have been many, of course, as we mentioned, who have traversed those ranks, and it's it's kind of bittersweet in thinking about it. I'm glad that we enjoyed the history. We look back on it. We think about what's happening here in modern times. So here this Saturday, we have Canelo Alvarez taking on Jermell Charlo. Jermell Charlo is jumping up 2 weight classes from 154 pounds to 168 pounds. And I say dare to be great, taking it really throwback in some sense, but certainly when you go back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, heck, even before the late 1800s, it was nothing for individuals to jump up multiple weight classes to take on another fighter. And that's why I give these guys much props, give them their much due respect. And I said it and I'll say it again. They were a different type and different breed of fighter. They were a tougher type of fighter. They were just tougher individuals, tougher men, women, in terms of what they have to deal with from conditions, as it relates to the conditions by comparison to us here in the modern day, modern times, etc. So it's easy for an individual to take some film or footage from some of these guys from back then and think that, oh yeah, these guys couldn't fight, or these guys they wouldn't beat a modern fighter or a modern guy, someone living here today. And I just say I digress. You go back to their time and see if you could fight those guys, and I'd imagine you'd be in for a rude awakening. But just wanted to throw that piece out there. So I commend those guys who are going up and really putting their health on the line, taking on these bigger guys, because of course the sport is far more safer for individuals involved now than it was for those individuals back then. in addition to the fact that they were fighting at a more expedient pace in terms of number of fights in succession and long term, we know that's not good for the health, but those guys did what they had to do.
Yeah, and the sport transitioned over time from being seen by seasons as just sort of like a fight to fight sort of thing. It took decades and decades to settle down, generations. But, at this time, if you went on a run, you could very quickly show yourself to be a top guy. So like I'm looking at Langford's 1909 here. Now, don't quote me on this. I'm pretty sure Jim Barry was a little bit larger than he was. Morris Harris, I'm pretty sure, was larger than Langford. Not sure about John Willie. There's Barry again. The Michigan Giant Al Kubiak was larger than Langford, heavier. Big Sandy Ferguson was heavier than Langford. Frank Craig was not. That was just an exhibition. I guess he was scouting Langford for William Iron Hague's camp in London. Langford found out about it and put him through a hellacious beating. Not a fight, just an exhibition, but it was a thorough trouncing uh, as punishment. But then anyway, William Iron Hague had dozens of pounds on Langford. Klondike Haynes larger than Langford. Dixie Kid 15 pounds lighter. Klondike Haynes larger. Mike Schreck was heavier than Langford. So I'm pretty sure Langford went 11-0, and he was only the larger guy in the Dixie Kid fight. He melted his innards with body shots, which was one of Langford's specialties. But Dixie Kid went 11-1 with the only loss to Langford that same year. So single fight, yes. When they matched head to head, yes, they Langford got the best. But I'm pretty sure Dixie Kid got 2 wins over Jeff Clark that year. Clark got a win over Langford some seasons later. It's not the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark. So it's like, you can't. It's hard to judge by any one fight in this era. And I just look at it like seasons. Like there are guys, they might lose their biggest fight, but they're putting in that work. They all deserve a lot of respect. This is very dangerous. Langford went blind. He still fought for like 8 or 9 years after that, but like he went blind in one eye. He was fighting. He was still giving up size, height, and size, half blind. So these guys go through a lot. They deserve their respect, and that's why we're here celebrating this, as well as the great stuff that's happening today. And as far as Charlo jumping up 2 weights to fight Canelo, I say go for it. That reminds me of some of these. Langford was walking around about the middleweight limit when he fought Jack Johnson, who was already the colored heavyweight champion. So jump up, man. Jump up and do it. There's a good chance he's going to get beat up because the size might show, but I love it. I absolutely love those kinds of things. Make the leap.
Mm-hmm.
When is that fight? What's it on? What service is it on?
It's actually going to be a pay-per-view. Showtime is backing it, so you can order it through Showtime for sure. That's like the main, I guess, provider or broadcast. So that's going to be Saturday. Of course, the preliminaries generally kick off probably around, from an Eastern time frame standpoint, probably around 5 p.m., somewhere in there. Haven't looked into the exact particulars, but it's pretty solid, just overall card. In addition to the main event, it's just a solid overall card. So certainly recommend it, but of course, pay-per-view. So, kind of have to weigh your options as far as there.
Yeah, well, if I wait, I have Showtime, but if I wait, do they replay it like a week later or something?
Oh yeah, I'd imagine they may ultimately end up replaying it. Yeah, at some point they
Well, that's
usually
cool
do
with me.
that.
I don't mind. I don't mind waiting. I'm really interested in what happens. I can enjoy it on a nerd level as far as what happens and what it means
Mm-hmm.
structurally without having to see it live. Some of the MMA stuff, the Bellator, I need to see that live whenever possible, but I don't think I have the money for it. I've been buying boxing books.
Oh yeah, no, I'm
I
with
got
you.
the same book as you. I got that Colored Heavyweight. Was it the Colored Heavyweight Champions book?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That
You
is
you
right.
said you're
And
interviewing that guy? You got an
yes, yes,
interview with the author? That's so cool, brother.
Mark Allen Baker. Shout out to Mark Allen Baker. Big shout out to Joe Cusano, who I interviewed not too long ago. He was one of the officials who got me into the sport of boxing, gave me all the info that I needed to get things started in the officiating ranks. Retired official himself, and just so happened to be friends with Mark Allen Baker. And yeah, so gonna be interviewing March 8th or October 18th, and October 18th, 7 p.m. Eastern time. Very much looking forward to it. Man, digging through this book, so much stuff revealed. I've learned a good deal of things. Some of them I knew of, but I learned a lot of stuff about C.C. Smith that I didn't know, which was one of the reasons I ended up doing that discussion on C.C. Smith. But yeah, just want to touch on that.
Super cool. And that was that the interview you already did, the one with your mentor of sorts? I think I saw that,
Yeah,
unless
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
confused.
Joe Casani
Yeah,
representing
that was great.
Connecticut.
That was a
Mark Allen
great interview.
Baker out of Connecticut as well. Yeah, yeah.
I thought
Been
that was
around the
one, but I'm
sport.
easily confused, so I had to double check. Yeah, that was really good.
Oh,
That
oh
was
yeah,
nice. That
yeah.
was some
Joe
good
was
stuff.
great.
Yeah, check that out, folks. Look at 86 Boxes channel's got a whole slew of stuff. Quick shout out to two channels I support. Scrapbook Boxing Museum, the Forgotten Fisticuffs, and go check out Hardline Boxing Talk. It has a bunch of statistical stuff, as well as some great story stuff back in the archives. But Scrapbook Boxing Museum of Forgotten Fisticuffs, just the most amazing stories. Shares graphics from his collection. Go support those channels, folks. Definitely. I think we're simulcasting, right? So if you're not already on 86 Boxing's channel, go over there. If you just happen to be a subscriber, I have that he doesn't already. But yeah, we were talking about Langford's prime. Let me just circle back to that. So let's see. In 13, Jeanette was considered to have gotten the best in a newspaper decision, one of their fights in New York. And then Gunboat, he came in heavy for that Gunboat fight in 13.
Hmm.
So I don't know if before then he had really come in out of shape and heavy, but that became a whole thing. You know, he got the best of Jeanette before the year was over. Fantastic. But so you could say that was the first chink in the armor in 13. But he'd been in Australia with all that good beer.
Oh yeah.
So that's my theory, is that the beer in the late 1911 through all the way through 1912 and then early 1913, the beer took its toll on his system, because they got the good beer down there. But you can see it's hard to say, because look at his 1914. And that included a fight in October, a rematch with Gunboat, who said he ruined him in that fight. He absolutely destroyed him in that fight because he'd been bragging because he had gotten the best of him. That meant a lot in those days. But Langford came in supreme shape that October and put a real beating on him. But look, right after that, 6 days later, in fact, he fights Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, the aforementioned Joplin Ghost, great fighter in his own right, great jabber mover. And Clark got the best of him in one of their fights. So, just because Langford smacked the crap out of, Dixie Kid in their fight because he had a little size doesn't mean that everyone beats everyone who everyone else beat. Like, you can't do the math. They have to fight. These guys are great. They put in real work. But it's hard to, in 15 now, Langford really, this is when you can say his prime is definitely over. He's on the downside. But he's still world class. He's just fighting at the crazy level, as you know. In fact, his toughest season is yet to come. 1916 is the most bizarrely difficult season I've ever seen. I don't know about you, but just skipping the guys who aren't in the Hall of Fame or very dangerous, maybe should be in the Hall. Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark, Sam McVeigh, Harry Wills, Sam McVeigh, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, and then some other fights all in 1 year. It's absolutely sick. And he wins most of his
Yeah.
fights, which is ridiculous. He's not in his prime anymore, but he's still that good. So like the fights you were mentioning with Wills, this is when Langford's on the downside, but he's still world class. Wills is coming up. He's among the better guys, but he's still going to mature. And then later in Will's career, he could get Langford out. He could get the best of him, even though Langford was still kicking a lot of butts.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's certainly cool pulling it up and seeing it from this perspective. Earlier when I was just kind of leading to probably around that 1916 time frame, because in between that, you made some good points. There were some you started to see some chinks in the armor, but when you really dive into the resume, it really puts things into perspective, because you really can't tell overall, because of the fact that he was beating good fighters during this period. But I just knew that, yeah, there was a point that he ultimately got to, as far as not being able to beat Harry Wills, and that kind of let me know in terms of yes, okay, he is no longer the same fighter he was for sure at this particular point.
Yeah, but it's possible to not be what you were, but still be the best. I would say that about maybe if Tyson Fury is still the top guy. If it's not Usyk, then he's not. I don't think he's what he was. He's just, but maybe he's still the best. Joe Louis, there was a question toward the end whether he was the best, even though he wasn't what he was. Klitschko, when he lost, I mean, he was getting older, like decline sets in, but you can still be better than everyone else, depending on who's around you and who you're fighting. So, yeah, Langford was dangerous for so long. And even like as late as 1920, he had a stunning win-loss record, even though, again, he couldn't get wills. He didn't go undefeated, but just multiple, just a crazy amount of fights, but he wasn't the only one. 1911, which is a little bit after this fight with Dixie Kid. I mean, that's him, Jeanette, and McVeigh in 1911. Just 1 year. That's a lot of work. I mean, it's a different kind of thing. That's why I have to look at it like seasons. That's their combined season for three guys, three heavyweights, and they're not the only ones. It's just a whole different thing. But those guys, they couldn't get a world title shot. But what were they doing? They were in a richer texture than the title was going through at that point, fighting for colored heavyweight claims than the other title, which Johnson held, but wasn't really. Johnson, you could argue he had a tougher career leading up to his unified title reign.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to go through some dudes to get to and win the colored title and then maintain it, and all the other guys he fought. Once he won the thing, still impressive, but he was still epic, but maybe not as challenging. But certainly there was challenges there for him that he didn't partake of. Even after he lost his title, he was offered some fights that he didn't take with these guys in Wills. Like, it is what it is. He was great, but he'd already been great leading up to it. And just like we say with claims, it's not set in stone. Like, a lot of times guys have to fight it out to settle a claim, which is why Johnson beating Burns, but then later beating the old version of Jeffries meant so much, because that was the guy who had retired with the claim, undefeated with the claim, who had fought across racial lines, just not for the title. Fighting Johnson, who would come in and beat the guy who had ended up with the lineage after Jeffries. So that's why partly why there was so much. That was the mega fight. Once Johnson had the world title, he was just aiming to get Jeffries out of retirement. So fighting like Catchell and the other guys, like, that was stuff he knew he could win. He didn't want to fight the guys who might beat him. He wanted to fight Jeffries. Business. But Langford, separate from the whole title politics, Langford put that work in. He was willing to be the little guy in the equation. There he is with Big Bill Tate. Look at that. It's crazy. I think that's just some sparring, though. I don't think they're actually fighting in that room. Yeah, that's just a training. They did fight.
Major size difference.
Yeah. But, like, Langford wasn't the only one giving up size. Jeanette gave up weight to McVeigh in their finish fight in 1909, one of 3 fights they had that year, but he prevailed after 49 rounds, and he was the smaller guy. McVeigh was a tank,
Yeah.
But McVeigh was a tank who could fight going forwards or backwards. So someone like Jeanette, who was just all round amazing, but also had weaponized cardio, it still took him 49 rounds. And they went 20 rounds and 30 rounds in their other fights that year. I mean, this is like some.
Yeah, that's a fight that has argument for the greatest ever. There have been a number of them, but I would say certainly those that stand out when you think about the greatest fights ever. These guys having lost an insane amount of blood, having to be administered oxygen between rounds at one point, both of them. The amount of knockdowns that had taken place, Jeanette being knocked down, from what I recall, somewhere in the neighborhood of 27 times. It's just one of those I'd imagine just had to see it to believe it. Thankfully, we have great accounts, but for an individual who has no knowledge of it, yeah, it's probably hard for them to fathom such.
Yeah, I mean the standards are really high. So the finish fight, the 45 rounder, 20, even the like 20 and 30 rounders, like these often these kind of fights were for larger purses. They demanded larger purses, or that's how the club would get its money's worth. But you know, it's pretty crazy stuff. Someone I think it was Joshua in the chat, was saying Langford was starting to lose his sight by the 20s. That's true, but he actually lost one of his eyes in 1917, June 19th in Boston. The Rochester plasterer, Fred Fulton, took one of his eyes. Uh, but you could see Langford still went 4-2 the rest of the year, including stopping Kid Norfolk and beating the great Joe Jeanette on points. So that's pretty crazy. Even the same season that he like basically took 2 months off and then kept fighting after losing one eye. But by the 20s, he was losing sight in the other eye. He had a cataract. So it got worse and worse, but he still kept it going. He just, even like, okay, even past 1920 was like a comeback season. He was dangerous, couldn't get a title shot, but he had a huge win-loss, differential. But like even after that, here's one I made for a talk I think we did. Here's 21-23. He's basically blind.
Insane.
Look at that. That's the work he's doing. Basically blind. Now, not all those guys are high level,
Insane.
but that's the amount of fighting he already has. 200 plus fights going into this stretch. But here he is, just you know, it's just absolutely incredible what he was able to do. But like, if we rewind it back, because we've in a career like this, it's easy to just wander through it, which is awesome. But in 1909, this is when he's basically, a lot of people suspect he's the best for his weight in the whole sport.
Very solid
And
fighters there too. Random, I must add, very solid fighters on that list. That at random glance, many people may not know, but very, very solid fighters there. Jim Barry got around. Al Kubiak, German heavyweight, got around. Certainly was in with the number of top guys. Same with Big Sandy Ferguson. Frank Craig, of course, put in a lot of work, from a colored world middleweight champion there. Klondike John Haynes, claimant of the, or at least I guess you can say, the first guy to hold the black heavyweight title, which was short lived because he ended up losing that claim or whatever it may be to Frank Childs, and ultimately it didn't really carry on. But look at there, Dixie Kid, Klondike John Haynes again. I mean, Iron Haig, who you mentioned, Mike Shrek. I mean, that's a pretty stout 1909 there. I'd argue, yeah, look at those guys on the top end, and you'll see that those guys were in with some dogs, and of course, Sam Langford is one of them himself. So having him on their resume as a boost to them.
yeah, absolutely. And there are guys like that he would fight at times in his career, like battling Jim Johnson, who didn't have that many high level wins or draws. He had some, but at the highest levels, but also gave tough battles to guys who did end up getting on points or whatever, but was legit. It's just that if you keep getting matched against, if you keep getting matched again and again against like greats and then top contenders, then people inevitably, doing something like this where Langford has an undefeated season, it's very rare at that amount of fights at a heavyweight. There are guys that could do it, but it's like it's not the normal thing. It definitely stood out, but at this time, I've seen in the papers, they basically were saying, because at the time heavyweight's the main division, right, and everything else is to give the other guys a chance, basically, even if there's a lineage there. But the people were basically saying that these were the top four fighters in the sport for a time there: Johnson, Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, and that's across all weights. These guys are considered the top of the top when this division counted the most, even though Langford was small for the bracket. But so we're not just talking about, oh, it's a good division, this and this. We're talking about these guys were like really considered the cream of the cream, especially at a time when you really could go up and try and prove it. If you have the clay, like Langford didn't sulk at middleweight. He went up and fought guys light heavy and heavyweight, just did it anyway. And then grew into the division himself. But yeah, it was a very unusual time when you could. So this thing with Charlo, I love it. I absolutely love it. Canelo's had a ton of
Hmm.
fights at a high level. It's not like his legacy is ruined for fighting a guy coming up in weight. He didn't start out at that weight himself. It's just go for it. It's something entertaining. I wish they would do more of it, as long as the guys were busy enough that it didn't steal opportunity from other people. But Canelo's a pretty busy guy, so I don't see anything wrong with it. I'm excited.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it should be a good one. And he's still a major player in the sport. There have been those that have said that he's on the decline, and I was on a live earlier talking about the same thing, but I think it might have been exaggerated a good deal because in his last fight he took on John Ryder, a tough, stocky guy who similar in size very much, uh, a guy with a good deal of muscle on him, and he wasn't able to stop John Ryder, but you could argue he was close to it at one point. He did drop him, and I think, yeah, it was just a major moment for Canelo as far as this was his first fight back in Mexico at his home in a long period of time since he was very early in his career or early on there in his career. And regardless of what a fighter may say and all that, certainly that's big time. And there are a lot of things that happen. Some of the stuff you don't see, the cameras aren't there, etc. Big load to carry, all of that. So I think that the version of Canelo we're going to see tonight will certainly show up, man. Or not tonight, but on Saturday will certainly show up and show why he isn't as declined as some might argue. I think Canelo, we're going to see a version of him that is on par with what we've become accustomed to seeing. Like, hey, I'm one of the top dogs in the sport. I may be the top dog, and I'm going to prove it, but we'll see. It should be a good fight, though.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. You always want to see guys just risk something, like just do it. Maybe Canelo has the advantage, but he hasn't always been the larger guy in his fights. Just get it over with, get the fight on. We need the entertainment. And, Langford, like he didn't sit around in one division. So if he can do it, now, granted, Langford had the advantage of being widely hailed as the hardest puncher in the whole sport, regardless, irrespective of size. He just had the most pop, but not everyone has that advantage. But speed and dexterity can sometimes make up for it. Although, who was it who moved up and fought Loma? Was it Rigo? That went
Mm.
badly for him, Loma.
Yeah, it
But
was. It was Rigo.
I still admired the attempt. It's okay. Well, we want to see. The sport used to enjoy that when the top guys could go ahead and fight each other, even if they weren't in the same weight. And it's like today, cruiserweight sort of like sits between, and it kind of means that the biggest guys don't have to deal with as much speed as people used to. So if you're 240, like, and you're fighting a guy who's like 195, but really nimble, you might lose on points. It's not a given that you can catch him if he's literally working to just tag you and go. So it's like, yes, it does protect some of the smaller heavyweights in a way, but it also protects the larger heavyweights from speed, which can be utilized. Go watch Sharky's fight with Carnera. He was lighting him up with speed. Wonderful hooks to the body, hooks upstairs like Floyd Patterson style. Dip down and then either come to the body with a hook, and it looks the same at first. Come upstairs. That's a fun fight to go back and see. So size isn't everything, and then sometimes some
Certainly.
guys don't respond well to speed. Usyk's shown that some guys don't respond well to speed. He's not a particularly large heavyweight, although he's a pretty big fella.
Mhm.
That's true. This is the history. The graveyard of boxing history is littered with big guys who couldn't keep up with the competition. You can't just be big.
Mhm.
Although some guys, there are some guys in the past who would be too small today. Like the size disparity would be too much. I mean, we're talking about after Jeffries, who was a big fella.
Yeah.
Johnson wasn't small by '08 when he beat Burns. He wasn't a small guy either, but Jeffries was a big fella. These guys, not so much. So yeah, I'm not saying like if today you pluck Jack Root, who was a great fighter, but if you pluck him out of then and bring him today and then set him up in a heavyweight title fight, he's going to do well. But that doesn't mean Johnson couldn't, or that Langford couldn't, or even say Denver Ed, who was, I think he was about 220, ripped, not a small guy. I'm not sure about Bob Armstrong. I don't think he was quite that heavy, although he was tall.
Yeah, they were similar in height. Bob Armstrong had well, at least reported, had an inch on Denver Ed Martin, who came about at 6'3", but 6'3.5" too, have seen reported. So both of those guys were fairly slender. Bob had a little bit more mass to him than Denver Ed Martin, but they were still, I guess, more so on the
And you know
slender
what?
end. Martin
I'm
more
sorry.
slender.
I'm sorry, brother. I think now that I think about it, I think Denver Ed was more about 200. Because I think
Yeah,
Johnson gave up 20 pounds, but he wasn't 200 at that point. That was later in his career.
yeah. You're spot on. Yeah, Denver Ed Martin. Yeah, around 200, he could get in that 200 range and above. Same with Bob Armstrong. They oftentimes came in that 190 range, but they were, as mentioned, fairly slender heavyweights to a certain degree with respect to their height. Now, of course, I'd imagine, with the times or whatever it may be, they would pack on more weight or whatever if you compared it to modern times or whatnot. But either way, they were still very much men, large men being at those sizes, and they were fairly crafty in the ring. I did a video recently, or at least not too long ago, on Denver Ed Martin, and I felt it was very revealing because I learned a lot about him that I didn't know. So you have to certainly look beyond the record. And you mentioned Jack Johnson, who's someone who is polarizing. There are a number of polarizing figures in boxing, some more polarizing than others. And there's no question that Jack Johnson is one of the most polarizing. And you have people who are with them, against him, people who think he was good, think he wasn't, think he had a good resume, think he didn't. All that aside, but Jack Johnson, he had to put in a lot of work there early on. And certainly, the elephant in the room, we can go ahead and put it out. Yeah, his heavyweight reign left a lot to be desired. But to get to that point, no question, he had to take on some tough competition in order to do so. And when he did beat Denver Ed Martin, as you'll see in the video that was constructed on the 86 Boxing Channel, this was the Denver Ed Martin who was, for the most part, right there in line to take on James J. Jeffries. And from there, that became Jack Johnson. So that Jeffries fight should have happened well before it did. It should have happened pre Jeffries' retirement. And what would have happened? Hey, best guess right there, because Jeffries was no slouch and he had some things that would have been in his advantage. And Johnson at the time would have been giving up a little bit of experience on Jeffries for sure. So it would have been experience in overall fights, I guess you can say. And I think it would have been very interesting. I think it would have been very interesting. So it would have made for a good fight, though. I imagine it would have been filmed much like their fight that took place sometime later there. But that being said, I think those are things that should be known and should be factored in when you're just thinking about the guys at this time.
Yeah, I agree. And that's Denver Ed on the right. He's actually seated in the photo, and I forgot to adjust. He's actually taller than Jack Johnson. So he just looks
Yeah,
short. But he yeah, these guys are tough. So like as far as how size would translate, if all the big guys today, if it was basically open weight, and sometimes they had to fight a guy they had 30, 40 pounds on, but who was dramatically faster, I think it would be more exciting. I mean, in Japan in mixed rules, they still get it on with size disparities, and I love it. It's not always the bigger person that wins. Throughout history in Japan, with the size mismatches, they don't always go the way you might think if you just saw a photo of the two. Sometimes dramatically differently, but yeah, in this time there was just a lot of fighting going on, and clubs would pay. There wasn't really a commission to be like, oh, that's not fair. It's more like the club offers the purse or the promoter offers the purse, and then if they both parties accept and they agree on the split and the terms, then boom, you have the fight. So we got a lot of good stuff that way. But I think in the case of Johnson, like he really did legitimize, like after, even though he didn't fight the prime Jeffries, he beat the guys he beat the eventual champion who would re-legitimize the title. I do think Tommy Burns goes underrated. He re-legitimized that title. So when Johnson took it, it did mean a lot. And then a couple years later, he beats Jeffries, and now he's unquestionably the guy. And of course, that's when the hammer falls and everyone comes down on him. And he starts getting persecuted and everything like that. The society wasn't ready for that. The levers of power started to move against him, but and that interfered with boxing, a lot of politics and stuff. But just on the size thing, I would say, at his best, Rocky Marciano was not a large guy. He beat some really large guys. Joe Louis I don't think he even hit 200 pounds until he was starting to get deep into his career. He was like, I think 195 is at his best. And he was like, of all the guys, they were like, this is the guy who hits possibly the hardest ever. Maybe him, Langford, Fitz. None of those guys were large. Rocky people were talking about him in those terms, the hardest hitter ever, not a large guy. So, technique, toughness, bone density, all the different factors that go into punching. It's not just how big someone is. And I, for one, like the idea that Canelo's fighting an elite fighter from a lower weight. And let's just see what happens. Maybe the guy can outspeed him. I would love that. I'll be cheering against Canelo. I actually like Canelo, but I'll be cheering for the other guy just because I love chaos. And it would just be really cool. Maybe we'll see more of it.
Yeah, that always makes things interesting in the sport there. Charlo, just, irrespective of the weights, he does have the height and I believe the reach on Canelo, who, of course, has moved up. And he started out at 147, around that welterweight range. And Charlo, he's a 154 pounder. And he has a frame certainly to continue to move up. So 168 is probably somewhere he'll ultimately end his career. But that being said, yeah, it should be an interesting one. He's good enough to put up a decent fight for Canelo, and he is undisputed at 154 pounds, and he did it the old-fashioned way in some sense, as far as he was in there fighting the fights, for sure. He was in there fighting the fights. He had to pick up the belts, and when he had a setback, he came back in a major way, so he should make things very much interesting. So I like it from that sense, and it's throwback of him to dare to challenge in such a fashion as far as moving up. So we'll see how he does on Saturday.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. I don't think I can swing the pay-per-view unless I go in with friends, but I am getting more and more excited. But I just like weird stuff, and they just had a great Bellator event. There's another one coming up, the historic 300, Bellator 300. I think they actually had a double banger show or an unnamed one, so I don't think it's actually their 300th event, but it's their 300th numbered event, and I'm very excited for that. So this is a great time for mixed rules for me, and I'm just excited. Does Canelo? Because I had DAZN, so I got to see Canelo on DAZN before they went to pay-per-view, and I've seen some of the other fights after the fact. So yeah, this is cool, man. This is different, and that's cool if he's got less reach, even if he's going to be, probably naturally a little bit heavier at this point in his career than the other guy. That it's not like he's not fighting a midget. He's fighting an elite fighter. They all cut a lot of weight, so maybe they're not that too far apart. But size isn't the only thing that counts. We'll just have to see. We'll have to see the first time he lands a good left hook, see how the other guy responds, or if it's too much for him and he's like, oh, shoot, and makes too much of an adjustment. Because Canelo could really crack. I like watching him fight. He's one guy I'd be interested to see, though, with his style, how he would fare back in the day. That stalking style, I'm not sure how that would translate, to be honest. He's a smart guy. A lot of these guys would have to switch it up. But if you make the gloves smaller, maybe, and if you go back far enough, you take away the mouthpiece, or there's no prefab mouthpiece, so you can use a piece of orange or something. Have fun with that. Maybe they switch it up a great deal. Because I'm of the opinion not necessarily all the fighters of old could swim in the waters today, but I think the converse is true as well. A lot of the guys today, if you took them back in the old conditions, they might not enjoy it.
Oh yeah, no.
Even if they took all their training methods, even if you let them take all the steroids back with them, a lot of these guys, I don't think they'd have a nice time in the smaller gloves with the more rudimentary conditions, ringside weigh-ins, all that stuff.
Yeah, random. There's not a think they wouldn't. They would certainly not have a swell time. I was rewatching Willard versus Dempsey the other day there in Toledo, Ohio, 1909, July 4th, Independence Day, and the
1919.
temperature at ringside was over 100 degrees. And of course, we know that back then they weren't fighting with any form of top cover, so you were just in that. You were just in there. You just had to deal with that heat. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's incredible. And Langford was scheduled for 45 rounds against Jim Flynn in the third fight, which was their second of 1910, so the third fight overall. That was going to be 45 rounds outdoors in the sun in California. That's crazy, like these guys, like when Johnson lost to Willard too, that was outdoors, right? The heat.
Yep.
Hey, in the chat earlier, there's so many comments. I can't wait to listen back to this one, but also read through all the comments. We got so many. There's like 48 I haven't seen yet. 49. Keep talking, guys. I read everything afterwards. But they were talking about would, in his comeback year of 1920, would Langford have beaten Dempsey that year? I think it's
Mm,
weird. So I think it's obviously a tough fight for Langford, but Dempsey's style is not really optimal against a fighter like Langford. And so what you would have is, for me, a stylistic advantage for Langford with his sense of distance and his punching power and his ability to hit with either hand from any range and everything, the way Dempsey approached fight. But you're also talking about a prime Dempsey against someone who didn't have his full speed anymore, his mobility. So even if Dempsey had to switch it up a little bit, I'd favor him in that fight, but it wouldn't be a given. And Dempsey knew that. There's a reason that fight didn't happen, at all. Even when Langford was, but yeah, I would favor Dempsey in that fight. That is because that's Dempsey is 1919, 1920. That's Dempsey at his absolute peak, his absolute deadly
yeah.
best. So even though Langford wasn't like a good matchup for him, which is why I think it didn't happen, I do think, maybe 60% Dempsey to win, but
Yeah.
only 60%, if because Langford's power and the way Dempsey had his head out there and Langford's sense of distance and his long arms, because he was short, but he had long arms. So without ducking, he's already down where Dempsey's head is when he is ducking. And I just think he would have a chance, but I wouldn't favor him. I think he was too far gone at that point to keep up with the speed, and Dempsey would, he was a terror. So yeah, I think you got to give the man his credit. At his very best, Dempsey would have the edge, but I do think it was looking ugly enough as a matchup because Langford had a chin to go with it too. It's not like you could just get him out of there. So if Dempsey
Yeah.
started to wilt, he could. I think they were worried about the matchup. So yeah, but it's a slight edge to Dempsey. Credit where it's due. Another great fighter of that rich era.
Yeah. I'm with you there. I think that yeah, it would have been yeah, I can't say for certain that Dempsey would have got him out of there. Of course, Langford did take some knockout losses, but it was not like he was just a guy you could just go in there and dispatch of easily. So it took certain circumstance and certain circumstances to get him out of there. And I think that at that particular time, I would have favored Dempsey as well, younger, fresher fighter, peaking fighter, and I would have gone decision. That's what I put in the chat. And I think that one of the reasons is because Langford at that time, certainly with his declining conditioning overall, thin eyesight and all that stuff, he would have far better operated from the inside. And while Dipsy, you could argue, was one of those guys who could probably thrive better on the inside as far as where he could get his knockouts off at range or whatever. I do think he would have factored in what could come back from Langford, who was at that time, while over 200 pounds and not necessarily a slim and stout 200 pounds, certainly a guy with enough pop, enough girth to make for a lot of trouble for Dempsey. So I'd favor Dempsey via decision for sure.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. If gun in my head, I'd say Dempsey takes it on points, but the longer the fight goes, the more likely it is to get caught. And Langford had, even for a couple years after that, he always had deadly power. The question was he kept losing his sight more and more and his mobility. But 1920, he was pretty trim. He had been in worse shape in the previous seasons, couple previous seasons. That was like, it really was a comeback year. So it's not an easy fight. Now
Yeah.
let's rewind it. What about 1909 Langford against 1919 Jack Dempsey? This is Langford before he had his full size. So like by 1911, I know he came in at 160 for McVeigh, but he was heavier than that, around that. He had come in, I think, already at 170, 175 in fights. But in 1909, Dempsey's going to have some size on Langford, but Langford is already hit hard enough to, I mean, if you guys have ever seen the photo of the end of the William Iron Hague fight, who was dozens of pounds heavier, he was splayed out unconscious. I mean, he was all the way out. He had to be helped back after he did wake up, but like he really had that kind of like just ridiculous power. And that would be, I think, a good fight. I'm not sure who I'd favor. This is actually, to me, possibly an even fight. Sorry about that background noise. There's a chopper or something going overhead.
All good. Yeah, it's not
It's too slow
distracting or
for a plane.
anything.
It's got to be a chopper. But
Yeah, you're fine.
hold on a second.
Very interesting stuff there, Joshua Woods. Shout out to people in the chat. Flat
That was
Boxing,
the
Joshua Woods, Rodolfo Rivera Jr., Poland Ball, Just Frank, a number of others who dropped in, Rasclot 222. So just wanted to send a shout out to the chat there real quick.
yeah, big up everybody. And yeah, so I think this Langford and Dempsey is a good fight. If you go a year or two later, I start favoring Langford very heavily. Like 1911 Langford, I think, because unlike McVeigh, Dempsey is not a fighter who's dangerous on the retreat. Langford walks him down and just smashes him up. I think, personally, but I think 1909,
Yeah.
when Langford's a little bit smaller than Dempsey and they're not quite as comparable in overall weight, it's a good fight. Maybe I do favor Langford, but not by a lot. But I think by 1920, yeah, against the absolute best Dempsey, you got to favor the other legend. Regardless of the stylistic matchup, it's still the fact that he's a big fella himself, and he had a real crack to his own punches. So just because Langford was really hard to stop doesn't mean Dempsey couldn't. These guys are all human. So, but I think, yeah, the earlier spry Langford, who was hitting like a truck already, I think maybe he would be all wrong for Dempsey, plus the experience. I mean, by 1909, Langford has more experience than Dempsey got in his whole career. I think Langford's, let me think, he hit 90, I can't remember. I think it was 99 fights by the end of this year, something like that, somewhere in that range.
That's pretty insane thinking about it. Yeah,
so Langford that tore through Mike Schrecken around, stopped Haynes, wilted Dixie Kid's innards, like all that stuff, stopped Hague. Yeah, I think maybe, but it would depend. These guys make adjustments, just like we can't like watch Charlo and then watch Canelo and then assume we know how they're going to interact with each other on the night. The guys switch it up, so that's why I love these fantasy fights, thinking about them, because it's not a given that they'll just be robots and do exactly what they did against other guys.
Yeah. No, I'm with you there for sure. And make some great points. Yeah, Joshua Woods mentions he sees a prime fight going either way with Dempsey versus Langford. Yeah, I tend to lean in a similar direction. Thinking about this 1909 Langford, so certainly Dempsey would have had a bit more of the size on him. Just overall, of course, Langford was accustomed to being a shorter fighter. Would have had his reach would have been comparable enough to make things interesting. So yeah, and he definitely had the power to end things. Early on for Dempsey, of course, he got knocked out by fireman Jim Flynn, though there are varying kind of reports and etc. tied to that fight, just in general, in terms of the overall verdict and how the knockout came about or went down. That being said, there's no question that 1909 version of Sam Langford would have been very much a dangerous fighter for Dempsey, even in giving up weight. Yeah, take that version taking on 1919 Dempsey, 1920 Dempsey. Very interesting right there. Very interesting. I think they make for great fights just in general. Hopefully, it would have been a series that had it happened. It would be cool to have some type of simulator of some sort that gave us a real deal feel and a real deal look to the fight. But that being said, yeah, I think it would have been just very interesting fights, and we could argue very much offensive fights, especially if we get the aggressive version of Dempsey we saw during that period. He was looking to come in and end things early, and that would naturally trigger a guy like Langford to start to dish out some of the haymakers and heavy blows of his own right there in those types of situations. So I think the fans themselves would have won. And yeah, I think it just would have made for some entertaining stuff for sure. And Langford, of course, I rate higher overall, just in the pantheon of heavyweights, just thinking about the history. But certainly, Dempsey during that period would have made it very much interesting. So I think it would have been a good fight, just depending on the scenario and how everything went down with the two of them. Sign me up for it. That's all I say. Sign me up.
Hell yeah, brother. Me too. And I'm sure most of us, like, that would be, for those of us that know about Langford, the idea of him fighting a prime Dempsey. I mean, even in 20, it would have been a 19 or 20, it would have been a good fight. But
Yeah.
because of Langford's particular capabilities and the way Dempsey approached the fight, what he would need to do to beat Langford over the rounds. But yeah, but a prime Langford, prime Dempsey, that would be a special fight on almost on par with like prime Langford, prime Joe Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, my dream fight for Langford is like some like prime or like fight prime Archie Moore. I
Mm.
just think something about that, the way I just feel like at their best, that would be one of the all-time great collisions. If I could just make one happen, that might even be the one I went to first. In spite of
Yeah.
all the other great ones, that might be the one I went to first.
Yeah, that would be an excellent one right there. Haven't thought about it a great deal, but that would be an excellent one. Certainly, two very, very, very experienced fighters in the sport, and size wise, yeah, not too far off actually. Kind of similar, not necessarily trajectories, but similar overall kind of weight comparisons, I guess you can say, because when you think about where Archie Moore became more of his formidable self, it was at middleweight. Same for Langford, even though he put in a lot of work beforehand and had some very good fights, fought some very good competition. Certainly, there's some comps there when you look at the weight, and both of these guys ended up going up to heavyweight. Both of these guys were able to generate a lot of knockouts, and that's even being the case in a number of instances where they weren't the biggest guy. We know Archie Moore also was an older fighter when he was applying his trade at the top of the sport, and that didn't hold him back, of course, because the competition didn't slow down even as that age continued to increase. Similar case to Langford. Now, of course, Langford had a greater number of fights overall, so think about that wear and tear that got to him a bit quicker. There's just no way to slice it when you just have that amount of fights. Just thinking about what's officially reported, let alone what took place that we don't know of. And kudos to you, Random, who actually found a fight that was not reported not too long ago. I think that was earlier this year. So, right, this has been a good year in that sense. But, man, yeah, those are two absolute legends of the sport right there. And that's one I would absolutely, another one I'd sign up. I'd say sign me up. Let me know what I have to pay to get in there. Pay per view. Yeah, if I can get something ringside, I'm doing that whatever I can to make it happen.
Hell to the yes. Hell yeah. Hey, real quick, I found I think this was a graphic from Hold on, I got to turn the video off. I just got a little montage put together, but I found we were talking about Johnson, like his level of competition. I think
Yeah.
I found a graphic I made that led up to his fight in '06 for Langford, the guys he'd fought. Let me take a. Yeah, there's Langford training. That's Bob Armstrong, former color heavyweight champ. He's pushing off of him there. That was one of his training exercises, like posting off of the guys. He would use that in fights. You can see it in his fight with Jim Flynn, the third fight that's on film. He's pushing off, but he's combining it with these destructive uppercuts. But he's keeping him off by basically just playing push away like a big brother, but then he's lets him come in and hits him with a giant uppercut. You can see a guy with a barrel chest and long arms who's strong enough and set low to the ground. You know, he can really spike a guy off him.
The
He would
great
use that at
George
times.
Byers. Just want to throw that name out there.
Yeah, former middle and heavyweight color champion, but a middleweight, but who had also won. There's the graphic I was talking about. See, this is like some of the dudes Johnson had fought. This is before he
Yeah.
beat Tommy Burns in 1908. Hank Griffin, Joe Jeanette, Sam McVeigh, Ed Martin, Black Bill, Marvin Hart. He lost to Marvin Hart, Frank Charles, Klondike Haynes, Big Sandy Ferguson, George Gardner, who was a light heavyweight champion at one point, Joe Choyinski, young Peter Jackson. These are all serious dudes.
Serious for sure.
Young Peter Jackson was a smaller fighter who fought above his weight. Just like Langford, he gave up size to Johnson, but Jackson actually gave Langford a loss right after Johnson did. That was the last. So it was actually young Peter Jackson, the last loss that Langford suffered in 1906 before he took off some months and came back and went on that 35 fight unbeaten run. So it's just like, but Johnson was putting it in. He's a tough guy. So even someone like Big Sandy Ferguson, the slugger from Slugtown, from Chelsea, Mass, well, Canadian, but fought out of Chelsea, Massachusetts. He fought a lot at a high level, fought a lot of dudes. Sam Langford actually in his first full season, 1903, actually opened up. He was on the undercard of one of Sandy Ferguson's fights with Jack Johnson, which I thought was cool. That was like a couple months into his career, a few months into his career. He had already headlined other events, but that was, he was one of the fights on that card. It's funny how he sort of danced around these guys. He ended up fighting Ferguson multiple times and, of course, fought Johnson once in '06. But yeah, Johnson put in some work. Langford was doing it too. Lots of guys. We did our video on our first part on 1903. And I was looking at all the different guys and all the different seasons they'd all put in. And it really gets overwhelming. I'm like, wow, we're not talking about dozens of fights. We're talking about hundreds of fights. Which is pretty crazy. So but I think we touched briefly on the fight that we wanted to talk about, but we've done this wonderful freewheeling sort of like spin through Langford's career. I know it's getting pretty late. You're working tomorrow. So I think maybe we'll call it here. It's really awesome having you guys in the chat. I can't wait to read back through all that mess. That was a ton. It was just too much for me to follow and keep my thoughts in my tiny brain. But yeah, long story short, 1909 Langford, Dixie Kid had a giant set of cojones to move up and fight him, give up 15 pounds to this guy who was terrorizing even far above his own weight. So if you give up weight. It doesn't always work out that way, but in this instance, it didn't go well for him. Hopefully Charlo doesn't get his innards melted by Canelo or it's a different kind of matchup. But shout out to all you guys. Thanks for coming by. Thanks to you, Josh. And yeah, all the guys on the thing. I know we're on both channels, so I think a lot of the discussions happening over on 86's channel. So I have to remember to go look on both. I think I remember that from last time. But it's been real. And Josh, any final thoughts, sir? You still there? You might be on mute. Oh, never mind. I got a DM. He's going to be right back. So I'll just talk for a second until Josh gets back, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, Josh is back. Yeah, so bottom line, giving up size to Langford was tough because Langford was fine with giving up size. Langford was fine with fighting at a high level, being the smaller guy, fighting even at a legendary level. He's not the only one, but he's certainly one worth shouting out. There he is from the Iron Hague fight in London. So that's 1909. He was supposed to be fighting Jack Johnson, rematching Johnson that night. But you can kind of see in the photo how thick his chest is. This guy's a triangle of muscle, even though he was short. It's really incredible. But Josh, thanks so much for joining me. Any final thoughts, my friend?
So I would say, yeah, this was on Langford versus Dixie Kid. Dixie Kid, one of those guys who isn't a major name these days, though he was a top level fighter and a guy who, when you dive into his resume, you'll see why he was able to stand out in the sport because he did scrap it up with a number of top level competition. But Sam Langford, we know him as one of, if not the greatest the sport has seen. He, a lot like Dixie Kid and a number of the guys from this era who were fighting during that period, they have gotten more of their recognition and due here as time has gone on. We've become more familiarized with them. Technology has allowed us to see them. It has allowed us to read accounts of what they were able to do in the sport, so on and so forth. And I think that's the type of stuff that carries on the legacy of the sport, let alone the legacy of the fighters in general. And we have some fighters today who we mentioned, they dare to be great. They dare to move up, do what they need to do in terms of trying to excel in other weights. And it was a norm for these guys back then. And as I always say, I relish at the opportunity to have discussions on them because one, I'm a fan of the history, but not only that, I'm a fan of boxing. And if you can mix the two, I think it just makes for some excellent stories. And no question, a number of these guys from those periods, time frames where the conditions were very much dire by comparison to what they are today, they make for just grade A entertainment. I would say grade A entertainment. And I appreciate you, Random Acoustic Thoughts, for inviting me on, giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on it. I know we're all boxing fans, all of us here. Thank you to everyone who dropped in the comments. We all have a passion and share a similar view and liking to the actual sport in general and the history of the sport because we understand what these fighters went through, not from a physical standpoint as far as us being there and understanding it to that degree, but we understand based on what we've witnessed, researched, and been able to see via these videos, as I mentioned, and YouTube has allowed for a good deal of this stuff to be released. So thank you, Random. We'll have to do this again as mentioned. I know we have some other stuff on tap that we've talked about, and just let me know. We can get this stuff lined up for sure. Appreciate you, buddy.
Yeah, good stuff, man. Great having you on. Thanks for staying. You stayed a whole hour past your deadline, so you are a warrior, my friend. And, yeah, this is good. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'd like to do more of these. I've been doing Facebook posts a lot this week on on this day type posts. So I might just start doing short live streams each time I do one of those posts, do it on the same day. Just the many days. I mean, Langford had 315 known fights in his career. Actually, shout out to Dixie Kid. According to BoxRec, 163 fights himself. Just serious careers, so even some people just count losses, but it's really just every career is a story. These guys really push the limits, and so this has been great. And hopefully, Josh, I know actually over the next several days there are actually some. I think tomorrow is the anniversary of one of Langford's fights with young Peter Jackson, among others. But let's keep in touch in the back, and maybe we'll do some more of this stuff.
Sounds good, buddy. Sounds good. So yeah, thank you to everyone who checked in, and salute to Joshua Woods. Says, hope you get your black bar ready for the Corbett discussion. So that's tomorrow. They're random. Going to be talking James J. Corbett. 7 p.m. is what we're scheduled for. Should be a good one.
Oh, fantastic. I'll see you there. That's wonderful.
Good
Okay,
stuff.
folks. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and check out 86 Boxing tomorrow for his talk on the great James J. Corbett, the banker. Okay, well, thanks everybody, and it's been groovy. Have a great night.